Twilight settled over the city, draping wide avenues and looming skyscrapers with a soft glow. In the heart of the busy metropolis, ornate fountains stood sentry in public squares and hidden courtyards. They were places where office workers tossed coins for luck and where the exhausted paused for a moment of peace. Few suspected that tiny beings called water sprites dwelled there, their entire existence intertwined with the gurgling flow that cascaded from stone mouths and metal spouts. By day, the sprite's presence was only hinted at in the flashes of light dancing across the water's surface, or the curious way the droplets seemed to rise a hair too high before falling back into the basin. But at night, under the soft glow of lamplight, they ventured out to celebrate in swirling arcs and playful cascades, merging with the fountain's streams to keep their watery realm thriving. Among these small and ancient creatures, there was a leader whose aura shone more brilliantly than the rest. Her name had been lost over centuries in the human world, but to the sprites she was known simply as Nitria. She was older than any building in the city and had once danced in open streams before human architects channeled the waterways into elaborate fountains. She took pride in watching over her little charges, ensuring that the waters remained fresh and the flow melodic. Sprites throughout the city respected Nitria's boundless knowledge of the old rivers and her kind, patient demeanor. Often she could be found perched along the lip of the fountain in Fletcher Square, humming water songs in a language that had never been heard by human ears. One evening, after the last rush-hour commuter had scurried to catch a train and the only sounds were the subdued hum of passing cars, an unusual visitor arrived at Fletcher Square. This figure moved slowly, circling the fountain with measured steps. His posture was rigid, and his eyes had an uncanny gleam, as though they were searching every ripple for something hidden in the water. He wore a trim black coat and carried a small brass case. If any hapless human onlooker had passed by, they might have guessed he was simply a tourist fascinated by the fountain's classical design. But the man's name was Victor Gremaine, a collector of curiosities who traded in elixirs and artifacts, often believed to be mere legend. That night he had come for the fabled heart of the water sprites, rumoured to grant the bearer extraordinary longevity or maybe even immortality. Nitria sensed him before he spoke, the subtle shift in the air alerting her to a predator. She was invisible to most, a translucent figure in the haze of mist rising from the fountain. But Gremaine had spent years learning how to spot fleeting glimmers of magic. He saw a faint shape dancing across the fountain's surface and smiled a small, tight-lipped smile. The collector recognized the swirl of energy, the leader of all water sprites in the city. If he captured her, not only would he subjugate all lesser sprites by proxy, but he could harvest the essence that gave them their enduring connection to water. Gremaine stepped closer, hand sliding into his coat pocket for a ring inscribed with archaic runes. He whispered a short incantation, and the atmosphere around him took on a sudden chill. Nitria's eyes widened. She turned to flee into the water, but it was already too late. The ring sparked, and a field of shimmering light surrounded her. Her small form struggled, trembling against the invisible grip. Gremaine moved with chilling composure, opened the brass case, and placed Nitria inside a glass vial. In that instant, the hush of the city night seemed to snap. A stirring rippled through every fountain in the vicinity as the other sprites felt their leader's distress. The water in Fletcher Square's basin churned violently, splashing over the edges, but Gremaine finished sealing the vial. He paused, allowing himself a moment to admire the luminescent glow within. Then he disappeared into the darkness, leaving swirling, agitated water in his wake. In the hours that followed Nitria's capture, an unsettling stillness settled over the city's fountains. Morning arrived, and pedestrians remarked that the water pressure in many ornamental fountains seemed strangely low. Some even teased that the city must be cutting costs. But the water sprites sensed the disruption in their domain acutely. Something vital had been taken from them. Though each fountain boasted its own local group of sprites, Nitria was their unifying voice, the one who kept them connected like droplets forming a grand continuous flow. Without her, their essence faltered. Restlessness and shock rippled through them, as though a crucial anchor had vanished. One sprite named Rill, who oversaw a smaller fountain in a quiet park, felt a sudden compulsion to mobilize. Her turquoise eyes glowed with fierce resolve. The other sprites were gripped by confusion and despair, but Rill repeated Nitria's teachings: calm the currents, find the disturbance, unite against the threat. At nightfall, she gathered sprites from the neighboring fountains. They convened around the largest cascade in the city, a glimmering three-tiered construction near the historical district. There, away from human eyes, they raged at the injustice of their leader's abduction. Some demanded that they show themselves to all humanity to cause public chaos until Nitria was returned. Others urged caution, fearing that their exposure might lead to mass capture. Rill spoke with a tremor in her voice, tamping down her own fear. The only path forward was to work together and unravel the mystery of who had stolen their leader and how to free her. However, water sprites are not accustomed to travels far from their tethered fountain. The more distance they put between themselves and their fountain's waters, the more their energy wanes. It would take an extraordinary effort to breach Gramaine's lair once they discovered it. But they had little choice. Nitria had given them so much: guidance, unity, and the silent symphony that tied all fountains together. They would form a small rescue party that would slip through the city's underground water system, tracking the memory of Nitria's presence wherever it lingered. During their secret meeting, they were spotted by a human for the first time that night. Tishan Tishar Hartgrove, a part-time maintenance worker responsible for cleaning the ornate fountains in the historical district, was awakened by an odd hush in her apartment. She'd always held onto a lingering sense of wonder and possessed the uncanny ability to notice things others did not. On a whim, she took her bicycle and pedaled to the site of the largest cascade, expecting perhaps a broken valve or a clog to explain the unusual stillness. She arrived to find the fountain's water swirling in unnatural patterns, miniature whirlpools appearing on the surface. Then she glimpsed a faint shimmering light, dozens of little shapes flitting across the water. Tisha stood, astonished for a moment. She had always believed stories of fairies and spirits were just old wives' tales, yet there they were, undeniably real. The sprites, too preoccupied with their own crisis, failed to notice her at first. But the moment Tisha moved closer, a ring of them rushed to hide. Rill stepped forward cautiously, a rivulet of water trailing behind her. Tisha froze, transfixed by the miniature figure. A hush passed among them, for it was exceedingly rare that a human could see their true forms, let alone approach them without fear. Rill, remembering Nitria's generosity, decided to take a chance. She spoke using the watery resonance of sprite language, the words sounding like trickling streams. Tisha understood only fragments of meaning. She knew they were distressed, that someone powerful had been taken from them. Mustering her courage, Tisha softly said, "I want to help." One of the older sprites growled in protest, suspecting a trap, but Rill raised a hand to silence him. Without Nitria's counsel, they needed a bridge to the human world if they were going to find Grammaine, and Tisha, with her job tending to the fountains, might be a blessing. Tisha crouched by the fountain's edge, trying to calm the flickers of panic that coursed through her at the impossibility of what she was seeing. "Tell me what happened," she managed to say, feeling a surging empathy toward these fragile yet resolute beings. Through halting words, gestures, and illusions shaped from water, Rill conveyed the story of Nitria's abduction by the mysterious collector. Tisha stared in disbelief, piecing together the fragments of sprite speech. She gathered that, in some twisted way, their captor believed the heart of the fountain's magic could grant him immortality. Over the next nights, Tisha devised a strategy. Working double shifts gave her official access to locked maintenance tunnels running beneath the city. She knew how labyrinthine the subterranean pipelines could be. Water for the major fountains was channeled from a central reservoir, weaving through a complex network of valves and filtering systems. If the sprites could travel along these routes, or even remain in the water, she might be able to guide them close to Gramaine's hideout once they discovered its location. But that first required a clue. Tisha suspected Gremaine was no ordinary trespasser, so she started hunting for any record of unusual men seeking permits for hazardous material or dabbling in old occult texts. She found nothing in the official database. In the evenings, while the city's rhythm slowed, she'd meet with Rill at the fountain. There, the Sprites practiced merging their energies. They formed swirling water ribbons that were firmer than normal, able to deflect small objects and carve new paths in the water. Tisha couldn't fathom the extent of their abilities, but she recognized a deep sincerity in their training. They poured all their heartbreak and anxiety into these group exercises, forging illusions of floating shapes and watery limbs that could grab and pull. She worried about them. Each time they traveled away from the fountains, they grew wan and translucent, but they refused to rest. Though her own life was turning upside down, she was skipping social gatherings, missing phone calls from worried friends. Tisha pressed on. She felt an obligation that ran deeper than logic. If someone was cruel enough to imprison these gentle spirits for personal gain, they deserved to be stopped. One restless night, Tisha took refuge in an old municipal archive building. She hoped to find property records that might lead her to Gremaine. The place was lit by a single fluorescent bulb and smelled of aged paper. She nearly jumped out of her skin when she spotted a large ledger titled Private Collector Permissions, 1890 present. Thumbing through the brittle pages, she found an entry referencing a Victor Gremaine, dated nearly 40 years earlier. That was impossible, she thought. He would have to be in his 80s at least. Yet the neatly typed text indicated he had purchased a dilapidated historical bathhouse near the city's old district. Rumors suggested it was built over a natural spring that once fed local wells. Tisha's heart pounded as she made the connection. With dread and excitement swirling inside her, she photographed the page's details with her phone and staggered outside into the cool night air. That same evening, Rill and the Sprites had gathered at Tisha's apartment, appearing like shimmering droplets dancing in mid-air. They waited impatiently, each minute without their leader an agony that weakened their collective spirit. At long last, Tisha returned with the crucial lead. She explained what she'd discovered about the abandoned bathhouse. The Sprites exchanged glances, an undercurrent of hope passing among them. They huddled around Tisha, their soft voices joining in and swirling like a babbling brook, urging immediate action. Tisha hesitated, considering the dangers. Gremaine was no mere mortal with a passing fancy. He had knowledge of spells, artifacts, and an unearthly obsession with immortality that might make him capable of unspeakable acts. Nevertheless, Tisha could not bear the agony in the Sprite's eyes. Together, they devised a plan to infiltrate the bathhouse via the old aqueduct lines that connected to the building's lower vaults. When the appointed night arrived, the city was enveloped in low-hanging fog. Tisha, armed with little more than a flashlight, maps, and unwavering determination, led the rescue party through a maze of maintenance corridors. She waded through knee-deep water at times, always accompanied by the faint glow of the Sprites hovering close. Dripping pipes overhead occasionally rattled, making her jump. The stale, humid air was thick with the scent of mildew, but it had no effect on the Sprites, whose entire being was fused with water. As they ventured deeper, the swirling illusions they used to move about grew taut with tension. Eventually, they emerged into a subterranean chamber beneath the old bathhouse. Once, this space might have been a luxurious thermal bath, its mosaic floor still showing faint patterns of marine life. Now it stood eerily empty, save for a few columns supporting the sagging ceiling. Tendrils of algae clung to the walls. Tisha felt a shiver down her spine as she realized they were treading on a place drenched in magic. She grasped her flashlight tighter and motioned for the Sprites to fan out. Their watery shapes glided across the old pool's surface, searching for any sign of Nitria or Gremaine. A sudden echo broke the silence. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, began descending a nearby corridor. The Sprites darted behind stone columns, the watery ribbons they'd been training to wield rippling dangerously in the air. Tisha raised the flashlight, and the beam caught a glimpse of Grenane's face, the outline of his black coat, and that eerie brass case. His expression was triumphant, too calm, inhumanly so. In the faint light, Tisha saw he looked far too young for a man whose name was recorded in documents from decades ago. There was a sneer curling at the edge of his lips as he set the brass case down on a crumbling ledge. "She's not going anywhere," he said, voice echoing. "The heart of her power is being drained bit by bit to feed me." His gaze flicked over to Tisha, who stood, trembling, and then to the sprites now emerging from hiding. "So you found me, did you? It was only a matter of time." Tisha gritted her teeth, every fibre of her being telling her to run. But one look at Rill's determined expression steadied her resolve. Water began lapping at the stone floor in a growing tide, controlled by the sprites who were summoning every drop of moisture they could find. The columns groaned under the pressure, and the rising water cast flickering reflections on the ancient mosaic. Gremaine calmly opened the brass case. Inside was a small vial, and within it shimmered Nitria's faintly glowing form. She looked drained, her light almost extinguished. "A pity you wasted your strength coming here," he said, holding the vial aloft. "Once I finish extracting her essence, it's mine forever, and you will vanish, worthless without your leader." Rill let loose a fierce cry that vibrated like churning rapids. With a collective roar, the sprites directed a watery blast toward Gremaine's hand. He staggered, nearly dropping the vial. The arcs of water glistened in mid-air, swirling with aggression. Gremaine snarled and slipped the ring onto his finger. Sparks of arcane energy crackled, warping the air around him. The protective field repelled the water, sending droplets scattering like shards of ice across the stone floor. Still, Tisha noticed Gremaine's eyes flicker uncertainly. He might have powerful artifacts, but the environment favored the sprites. Water seeped from hidden cracks, from old channels that once fed the baths, forming puddles that slithered toward Gremaine's feet. Rill shouted, and several sprites joined forces, weaving illusions that coalesced into a towering shape of swirling liquid. It lunged forward, colossal yet graceful, smashing into Gremaine's protective field. The shield cracked slightly under the wave, forcing him to backtrack. Gasping, Tisha saw an opening. She remembered the etched runes on the ring Gremaine wore. Perhaps it needed direct contact on the skin to function. Summoning her courage, she waited until the watery force pinned Gremaine briefly against a pillar. With him distracted, Tisha rushed in, hoping to knock the ring off. She managed to grab his wrist, but a jolt of arcane energy flung her aside like a rag doll. She landed hard, dazed, her flashlight skittering away. Gremaine hissed in frustration, adjusting his ring. "I've come too close to fail now," he roared. "You cannot resist the tide of immortality." Rill and the sprites wouldn't give in. They mustered another fierce wave of water. It slammed into Gremaine, forcing him to drop the brass case. Although he clung to the vial containing Netria, he no longer had a firm grasp. Rill quickly directed several smaller sprites to swirl around Gremaine's hand, trying to pry open his fingers. He fought back desperately, electricity snapping across the watery illusions, causing them to dissipate in sizzling bursts. If the sprites had been lesser beings, they might have fled. But their devotion to Nitria overrode fear, and they tirelessly reformed in the flicker of lamplight. A flash of insight crossed Tisha's mind as she coughed and stumbled to her feet. She remembered an old warning she'd read about in one of the city's engineering references. Some of these bathhouse tiles contained lead or other metals that could short-circuit certain magical energies. She looked down, spotting a faint patch of mosaic that had a dull metallic sheen. Drawing one last burst of courage, she yelled for the sprites to push Gremaine onto that spot. Rill responded instantly, directing a fierce torrent that seized Gremaine's ankles and dragged him backward. He landed on the worn mosaic with a painful thud. There was a crackle of sputtering arcane light and his ring flared bright, then dimmed. The protective field wavered. Seeing her chance, Tisha lunged once more, ignoring the sting in her limbs. This time, Gremaine's ring was faltering, and she wrenched it from his finger. The ring clattered across the floor, lost among the rubble. Immediately the shield collapsed. The sprites converged like a storm, swirling around Gremain in a whirlpool of water and cutting off any hope of escape. He raised the vial in desperation, but the swirling torrent battered his arm until his grip faltered and Nitria's container slipped from his hand. Rill caught it gently, her watery form cradling the precious capsule. Then with a shimmer of azure light, she opened the vial. Nitria emerged, battered but alive, her glow pulsing weakly. Free from confinement, she let out a trembling breath, and even in her diminished state, her presence resonated throughout the chamber. "Leave," Rill whispered to Gremain. Her eyes narrowed. The swirling water pinned him down, periodically splashing over his mouth when he tried to speak. With the ring gone and no arcane trick left at his disposal, he could only look on helplessly as the sprites recovered their leader. Tisha half expected them to exact revenge in some terrible form. But that wasn't the sprites' way. Their dominion thrived on flowing streams and gentle healing. Revenge was foreign to their ancient, watery nature. They only needed Gremain to be powerless. Rill gestured, and the torrent let Gremain stagger to his feet. Terrified and drenched, he sputtered. "You don't understand," he began, but Tisha moved closer, her voice low. "If I were you, I'd leave this city and never touch another fountain. Because they'll know. They'll always know." Gremain stared at her, chest heaving. But as soon as the sprites pulled back the swirling water, he limped away, disappearing into the darkness. A moment of profound quiet settled over the old bathhouse. The dislodged water slowly ebbed, lapping softly against the broken tiles. Tisha found herself face to face with Nitria, who was no bigger than her hand, yet exuded an ageless aura. The leader of the sprites glanced into Tisha's eyes and gave a small nod. Though no clear words were spoken, Illa understood it to be an immense thank you. Rill approached, and together they formed a soft stream that circled Tisha's ankles, a gesture of gratitude and kinship. Carefully, they escorted Nitria out through the same water channels they had come, the rest of the sprites following in a protective formation. Under the shimmer of city streetlights, they emerged into the night. One by one, the sprites began to disperse, returning to their respective fountains, eager to bring Nitria's presence back to each community. Tisha walked alongside them for as long as she could. Her clothes were drenched and she was exhausted, but relief made her steps light. Their bond was uniquely forged in adversity. One by one, Rill and the others disappeared into the water, leaving Tisha standing at the edge of Fletcher Square's fountain. She gazed at the reflection of the skyline in the fountain's rippling surface, marveling at how everything now felt so different, more alive, more wondrous. In the days that followed, the fountains across the city bubbled merrily once more, as though revived by a hidden life force. People paused to appreciate the crystal-clear water instead of hurrying past. Very few realized that, in the dead of night, a small revolution had taken place, saving an ancient guardian of the waters. Tisha did not speak of it openly. On her rounds, she'd smile knowingly to herself whenever she saw a flash of iridescent light dancing among the ripples. A small greeting from the sprites. Occasionally, Tisha thought of Gremain and wondered if he would ever attempt another campaign for immortality. But the memory of what happened in that crumbling bathhouse convinced her that the city would not yield easily to such a threat again. The water sprites, once shy and hidden, had discovered the depth of their own power. Even without their lead, they had orchestrated a revolt, fighting back for what was right. With Nitria restored to her rightful place, they regained their unity and sense of purpose. As the sun rose on a particularly clear morning, Tisha stood by Fletcher Square, watching the light play across the water. She tossed a single coin into the fountain, not for luck, but in thanks. A faint echo of sprite laughter seemed to resonate from the depths. The water shimmered as if returning the gesture in kind. Tisha realized that though the world appeared the same to most people, it held hidden wonders. And now, just maybe, some part of the city's magic, and the bond between human and sprite was a little closer to the surface, waiting to be rediscovered.